A cold autumn wind howled between the bare trees as Emily turned her old Ford onto a narrow dirt road. She had been on the highway for hours and decided to take a shortcut through the woods to get to her grandmother's house in the small town of Oak Grove. The sky was overcast with heavy gray clouds, and the first drops of rain hit the windshield. Emily turned on the windshield wipers and slowed down. The road was becoming increasingly blurry and slippery. The dense forest surrounded her on both sides, creating a feeling of claustrophobia. The girl nervously looked at her watch. It was almost 7 p.m., and darkness was fast approaching. Suddenly, the headlights snatched a figure from the darkness on the roadside. Emily sharply turned the steering wheel, almost driving into a ditch. Her heart was racing. She looked over her shoulder, but saw no one. Probably just a shadow from a tree. She tried to reassure herself. Soon, however, Emily caught another glimpse of movement in the trees. This time, she could clearly see a human silhouette that seemed to be running parallel to the car. The girl stepped on the gas, trying to get away from the creepy stalker. Suddenly, the engine coughed and stalled. Emily turned the ignition key in a panic, but to no avail. She was stuck in the middle of the forest, and darkness had almost completely enveloped everything around her. With trembling hands, Emily pulled out her phone, but of course there was no signal. She froze, listening to the sounds of the forest. The sound of rain and wind mingled with the cracking of branches and the rustling of leaves. Suddenly, she heard a crunching sound very close by. Emily turned her head sharply and screamed. A pale face with burning eyes was looking right through the passenger side window. Without thinking, she jumped out of the car and started running. She heard heavy breathing behind her and the sound of approaching footsteps. Branches scratched her face and clung to her clothes. Emily tripped over a root and fell, hitting her knee painfully. Looking up, she saw a tall, dark figure looming over her. Screaming, Emily crawled backwards and ran into a tree. The figure drew closer, and in the dim light of the moon breaking through the clouds, she could see the distorted face of a man. His eyes were empty and lifeless, and a creepy smile was frozen on his lips. The man stretched out his hands with long, dirty fingernails toward Emily. She closed her eyes, expecting the worst. But suddenly she heard a loud dog barking. Emily opened her eyes, but her husband was nowhere to be seen. A large black dog emerged from the darkness and rushed to the girl, wagging its tail happily. Behind him, an elderly man in a hunting jacket was running with a flashlight. He helped Emily up and asked her what had happened. It turned out that his hunting lodge was nearby. The man offered Emily to spend the night there and help her with the car in the morning. As they walked to the lodge, Emily kept looking back, but she didn't notice anything else suspicious. However, the eerie feeling of someone's presence did not leave her. It seemed as if someone was watching them from the darkness. In the hunter's cozy house, Emily calmed down a bit. He gave her hot tea and a blanket. But the girl could not fall asleep. She sat by the window, peering into the dark forest and shuddering at every rustle. At dawn, the hunter took Emily to her car. While he fumbled under the hood, trying to start the engine, the girl looked around nervously. Suddenly, she saw bare footprints on the damp ground, leading from the forest to the car and back again. Emily shuddered as she remembered the horrible face of the night stalker. Finally, the engine started. Thanking the hunter, Emily drove away quickly. She didn't stop until she was out of the forest and on the highway. Only then could she relax a little. But for a long time after that, Emily would flinch whenever she saw any movement out of the corner of her eye and avoided driving on forest roads, especially at dusk. A few days later, the news reported that a man's body had been found in that forest. According to preliminary reports, he was homeless and probably lived in the forest. The cause of death was hypothermia. But for some reason, Emily was sure that she had met a person who was not alive that night, and this thought scared her much more than meeting a crazy tramp. Since then, Emily has always carried a flashlight, a charged phone, and spare batteries with her. And she never took dark forest roads again, no matter how long the main road seemed. because sometimes a shorter path can be much longer and more dangerous than it seems at first glance. A cold autumn wind drove the clouds low over the treetops as Jake Harrison turned his battered pickup onto the dirt road leading to Wolf Lake. Raindrops drummed on the roof of the car, creating a monotonous rhythm that only emphasized the loneliness of the place. Jake had come here for his annual fishing trip, a tradition he had maintained for 15 years. Usually he came with his friends, but this year they all found reasons to cancel. However, Jake didn't want to break the tradition and decided to go alone. When the pickup finally pulled into the clearing by the lake, it was almost dark. Jake quickly set up the tent, trying to make it before the rain got worse. The wind was tearing at the tarp, making it difficult, but eventually Jake managed. Hiding in the tent, he took out a flashlight and a map of the area. Tomorrow he planned to go around the lake looking for new fishing spots. Jake was so engrossed in studying the map that he didn't immediately notice that the sounds of rain and wind had stopped. The sudden silence seemed unnatural. Jake looked out of the tent. The moon, peeking out from behind the clouds, cast a silver light on the surface of the lake. The fog floated over the water, creating ghostly shapes. Something about the scene made Jake shudder. He was about to return to his tent when he noticed movement on the opposite side of the lake. Squinting, Jake could make out a dark figure standing by the water's edge. The figure seemed too tall and thin to be human. Jake rubbed his eyes, thinking it was just a play of shadows. But when he looked again, the figure was still there. Moreover, it began to move, not walk, but seemingly glide over the surface of the water in his direction. Jake's heart was racing. He quickly zipped up his tent and grabbed his flashlight, trying to calm down. It's just fatigue and imagination, he convinced himself. But deep inside, Jake felt he had seen something real and dangerous. The night dragged on endlessly. Jake lay awake, listening to every sound outside. Several times he thought he heard footsteps around the tent, but when he held his breath and strained his ears, he could only hear his own heartbeat. At dawn, exhausted from a sleepless night, Jake decided to go fishing. Perhaps a familiar activity would help him calm down and forget about his nighttime fears. He took a fishing rod and walked along the shore, looking for a suitable spot. The morning fog had not yet cleared, giving the landscape a ghostly appearance. Jake tried not to think about what he had seen at night, focusing on choosing a place to fish. Finally, he found a small bay that looked promising. Throwing in his fishing rod, Jake sat down on a fallen tree and waited. Time passed, but the fish did not bite. Gradually, the fog began to dissipate, revealing the opposite side of the lake. And then Jake saw it again. A tall, dark figure standing between the trees. This time in daylight, he could see more details. The figure looked like a human being, but unnaturally elongated, with long, thin limbs. Its skin seemed gray and wrinkled, like the bark of an old tree. Jake froze, afraid to move. The creature slowly turned its head in his direction, and the man met its gaze with huge black eyes without whites. The sight sent a chill down Jake's spine. Suddenly, the creature made a sharp movement in his direction. Without hesitation, Jake took off running. He ran through the forest, not knowing the way, branches hitting him in the face, but he didn't pay attention. His only thought was to get to the car and drive away from here as far as possible. Running out into the clearing where his pickup was parked, Jake stopped for a moment to catch his breath. Looking back, he was horrified to see the creature gaining on him, moving at an incredible speed. With trembling hands, Jake tried to put the key in the lock, but he couldn't get it in because of fear. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the creature approaching. Finally, the door opened, and Jake jumped into the cab. Starting the engine, he took off without looking in the rearview mirror. Only when he got on the highway did Jake calm down a bit and slow down. He was shaking, and his heart was still beating furiously. After driving a few miles, Jake pulled over to the side of the road. He had to decide what to do next. Part of him wanted to just go home and forget about it all like a bad dream. But the other part of him realized that he couldn't just let it go. After much deliberation, Jake decided to go to the nearest town and tell the sheriff about it. He realized that his story sounded crazy, but he couldn't just keep quiet. At the sheriff's office, Jake was met with disbelief. Sheriff Thompson, an elderly man with a gray mustache, looked at him as if he were crazy. But when Jake described the creature, the sheriff's expression changed. It turned out that Jake was not the first to see something like this in the Wolf Lake area. There had been several similar reports over the past 50 years, but no one had ever been able to provide proof. The sheriff told Jake an old Native American belief about a lake spirit that abducts lone travelers. According to the legend, this spirit was once a man, but due to a curse, he turned into a monster, doomed to roam the shores of the lake forever in search of victims. Jake didn't know whether to believe in these legends, but after what he had experienced, he was ready to believe in anything. The sheriff advised him to go home and try to forget about it all. But Jake realized that he would never be able to forget that eerie look in those black eyes. When he got home, Jake couldn't recover for a long time. He began to research the history of Wolf Lake, looking for information about similar cases. It turned out that over the past 100 years, several dozen people had disappeared without a trace from the lake. Jake contacted some of those who had also seen the creature, and their stories were similar to his own experiences. Gradually, he began to put together a picture of what was happening around Wolf Lake. But the more Jake learned, the more questions he had. What is this creature? Why does it live near the lake? And most importantly, how can it be stopped? Jake realized that he couldn't just forget about it and move on with his life. He felt responsible for preventing more victims, but he also knew that he was facing something beyond his understanding. Now every night Jake dreams of Wolf Lake and that terrifying creature. He wakes up in a cold sweat, still feeling the gaze of the black eyes on him. Jake knows that sooner or later he will have to return to the lake and face his fears. But for now, he's just trying to understand what he's dealing with and prepare for the upcoming encounter with the unknown. Meanwhile, dusk is gathering over Wolf Lake again, and a tall, dark figure appears in the fog above the water, waiting for its next victim. Gray clouds hung low over the rocky peaks of Dead Canyon as Sarah Lynch turned her car off the highway onto a dirt road. Her old Jeep shuddered over every bump, while the wind howled through the poorly sealed windows. Fall in the Colorado mountains was harsh and unpredictable, but Sarah couldn't wait any longer. She had to find her brother. Mike had disappeared 3 weeks ago during a solo hike in Dead Canyon. The police had conducted searches, but to no avail. They concluded that Mike had likely fallen off a cliff or become prey to a wild animal. But Sarah couldn't accept this. She knew her brother, an experienced climber and tracker. Nothing like that could have happened to him. The road worsened, forcing Sarah to slow down. Twilight was setting in, and the rain that had been drizzling all day turned into a thick mist. Sarah switched on her headlights and continued driving, peering into the fog that crept along the road. Suddenly, the headlights caught something strange on the roadside. Sarah braked sharply and got out of the car. It was a backpack, dirty and tattered, but Sarah recognized it immediately. It was Mike's backpack. Her heart raced. Sarah looked around, trying to understand how her brother's backpack could have ended up here. She was sure the police had searched this area. How could they have missed such an important clue? Sarah picked up the backpack and opened it. Everything inside was in place. Sleeping bag, food supplies, water bottle. It seemed as if Mike had simply set the backpack down and walked away. But where and why? A sudden gust of wind chilled Sarah to the bone. She shivered and returned to the car. She needed to decide what to do next. Her mind told her to return to town and report her find to the police. But her heart told her to keep going. After a brief hesitation, Sarah started the engine and continued deeper into the canyon. The road became increasingly impassable, and soon Sarah realized she couldn't drive any further. She parked the Jeep under an overhanging rock and got out, armed with a flashlight and her brother's backpack. The drizzle had turned into real rain. Sarah pulled up her jacket hood and moved forward. She had no clear plan. She just walked, hoping to find any trace of her brother. Hours passed, and Sarah kept walking. The darkness thickened to the point where her flashlight barely pierced it. Her legs ached, her clothes were soaked through, but Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't turn back without finding her brother. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. Sarah tried to turn it on again, but to no avail. She froze, trying to calm down and assess the situation. It was dangerous to continue without light, but she couldn't go back either. Sarah wasn't sure she could find her way back to the car in complete darkness. And then she noticed a faint glow in the distance. It was so dim that Sarah initially thought she was imagining it. But no, the light was real. It came from around a bend in the canyon. Without thinking, Sarah moved towards the light. Maybe it was a camp of tourists or rescuers. Or maybe it was Mike. When Sarah rounded the rock, a strange scene met her eyes. In the middle of a small gorge stood an old van, dim light pouring from its windows. Various junk was scattered around the van. Rusty canisters, piles of old clothes, some boxes. Sarah hesitated. Something about this picture seemed wrong. Who could be living here, in the heart of the desolate canyon? And why? But the thought of Mike pushed her forward. Sarah approached the van and knocked on the door. Silence. She knocked again, louder. Still silence. Sarah carefully opened the door and peered inside. The van was empty, but chaos reigned inside. Books, maps, and strange instruments were strewn everywhere. Photos and newspaper clippings hung on the walls. Sarah moved closer to examine them. And then her heart stopped. In one of the photos was Mike. He was standing next to a bearded man, both smiling at the camera. The photo was recent. Sarah recognized the jacket she had given her brother for his birthday a few months ago. What did all this mean? Who was this man? And where was Mike now? Suddenly, there was a rustle behind her. Sarah spun around and saw a tall figure in the van's doorway. It was the same bearded man from the photo. He looked at Sarah with a strange mixture of surprise and fear. Sarah opened her mouth to say something, but the man suddenly lunged at her. She tried to jump back, but in the cramped space of the van, it was impossible. The man grabbed her by the shoulders and pressed her against the wall. "Quiet," he whispered, pressing a finger to his lips. They might hear. Sarah froze, not understanding what was happening. Who were they? What was this man talking about? And then she heard it. A sound that made her blood run cold. A low humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It grew louder and louder. The man released Sarah and rushed to the window. He cautiously peeked outside and immediately recoiled, as if he had seen something terrifying. "They're here," he whispered, turning back to Sarah. "We have to run. Now." Without waiting for her reaction, he grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her towards the exit. They burst out of the van and started running deeper into the canyon. The humming became deafening. Sarah ran, stumbling over rocks and bushes, but didn't dare look back. She didn't know what they were running from, but the terror in the stranger's eyes was real. They ran for what seemed like an eternity. Their lungs burned, their legs were giving out, but fear drove them forward. Finally, when Sarah thought she couldn't take another step, the man suddenly veered to the side and dragged her into a small cave hidden behind a rock outcropping. They pressed against the cave wall, breathing heavily. The humming gradually faded, moving away. After a few minutes that felt like hours, complete silence fell. Sarah turned to the man, ready to bombard him with questions, but he beat her to it. "I know you're looking for your brother," he said quietly. "Mike told me about you. He was trying to help me, but they took him." Sarah felt the ground slip away beneath her feet. "Who are they?" she asked, barely hearing her own voice. The man shook his head. You won't believe me if I tell you. No one believes. That's why I live here, in the canyon, trying to understand them, find a way to stop them. He fell silent, as if hesitating whether to continue. But then, meeting Sarah's gaze, he sighed and began to tell his story. The tale he told was incredible. About creatures living in the depths of the canyon, ancient and powerful. About missing people and mysterious lights in the sky. About government experiments and hidden bunkers. Sarah listened, unable to believe. But at the same time, everything was falling into place. Mike's strange behavior before his disappearance, his interest in conspiracy theories, his unexpected trips to the mountains. Can we save him? Sarah asked when the man finished his story. He looked at her for a long moment. We can try, he said finally, but it will be dangerous. And you have to understand that Mike might not be the same person you knew. Sarah nodded. She didn't fully understand what she was getting into, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't leave without her brother. They spent the night in the cave, and at dawn set out deeper into the canyon. Uncertainty and danger lay ahead, but Sarah was ready for anything. Dead Canyon had kept its secrets for centuries, and now Sarah had become part of one of them. She didn't know how this adventure would end, but she understood that her life would never be the same. And high in the sky, above the rocky peaks, something strange flashed by. Something that shouldn't have been there. Dead Canyon was awakening, and its inhabitants were coming out to hunt.